Why would dogs start salivating at the sound of footsteps? And what does that have to do with how humans learn fear, habits, or even fall in love? To answer those questions, we need to talk about Ivan Pavlov. Though trained as a physiologist, not a psychologist, Pavlov unintentionally introduced a framework that would help define modern psychology: classical conditioning. His work not only influenced scientific psychology, but also left its mark on education, therapy, and advertising. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was born in 1849 in Russia. He initially studied theology because he wanted to become a priest just like his father. But after reading the works of Darwin and the Russian physiologist Ivan Sechenov, he turned to science, specifically physiology. Pavlov's early career focused on the digestive system, and in 1904 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology for his research on digestion in dogs. It was during these experiments that Pavlov made a curious observation. Dogs began salivating before the food was even there. Sometimes just the sight of the lab assistant or the sound of approaching footsteps was enough for them to start salivating. This reaction didn't fit the standard biological model. Salivation is an automatic response to food, not to the sound of shoes on a tile floor. Obviously, Pavlov was intrigued, so he designed experiments to investigate further. So he introduced what's called a neutral stimulus, in this case a bell, before feeding the dogs. After several pairings, the dogs began to salivate when they heard the bell, even when they didn't get any food at all. Pavlov had uncovered the basic form of learning through association. This became known as classical conditioning, a process in which a neutral stimulus, when repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus, comes to elicit a conditioned response. Pavlov's approach was novel in psychology for its use of controlled experiments and measurable behavior. No introspection like what Wilhelm Wundt would use, no speculation about the mind, just plain and simple stimulus and response. Pavlov's findings introduced several key ideas. For example, the unconditioned response, a conditioned response, generalization, discrimination, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. So, an unconditioned response is a natural reaction, such as salivating when food is present. And a conditioned response is a learned reaction, like salivating at the sound of the bell. Then there is also generalization. So once conditioned, an organism might respond to similar stimuli, like a different bell in the same way. Then there's also discrimination. With further training, responses become limited to specific stimuli, so the opposite of generalization. But there's also extinction. If the conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the unconditioned one, the learned response weakens. And then there is spontaneous recovery. A response that was considered extinguished can suddenly reappear after a pause. Pavlov sidestepped the mind entirely. His data came from measurable behavior, not subjective reports. This way of conducting studies was at the very beginnings of a new idea in psychology called behaviorism. After Pavlov laid the foundations for behaviorism, John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner took this idea a lot further. But don't worry, we'll have a video on both of them in this series later on, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. Although Pavlov himself stayed close to physiology, the implications of his work went quite a bit further than his physiology lab. For example, behavioral techniques like exposure therapy, you've probably heard of it, used to treat phobias and PTSD, rely on principles of extinction and systematic desensitization. Now, the concept of desensitization, the idea that you can make an individual less sensitive to a stimulus, and in fact create a new association in its place, was not exactly a term coined by Pavlov, but by the South African psychiatrist Joseph Wolpe. However, Wolpe was a pretty big fan of Pavlov's classical conditioning theory, and he used this as the backbone for his own work. In the classroom, teachers also apply classical conditioning principles, often without realizing it. For example, pairing difficult tasks with Positive reinforcement, like praise, can help students develop more motivation and confidence. Over time, students may begin to associate learning itself with positive feelings. Also, advertisers use classical conditioning to create positive emotional associations with their products. Think about a perfume ad. The product itself is neutral, but it's paired with attractive models and romantic imagery and beautiful music, and over time these pairings can lead consumers to feel a certain way about the brand, even if they're not consciously aware of it. This isn't exactly Pavlov's bell, but it's the same principle. So, in a way, you can blame Pavlov for buying stuff you don't really need. It's always nice to be able to point a finger. Ivan Pavlov showed that behavior could be studied systematically and scientifically. While he never considered himself a psychologist, his discovery of classical conditioning offered a powerful tool to understand learning, not just in dogs, but in humans as well. And it all started with salivating dogs and the sound of footsteps. Thanks for watching.